quite well known in Korea, Professor Curtis Kelly.
I'm not going to talk about so much what we can do in the classroom and those sort of things. I'm sort of interested in a bigger question. And the question I'm interested in is one that we all need. It's the basis for everything that we do in teaching English. And it is, why am I doing that? I've got this control. Well, how does the brain learn language? What's happening in our brain that causes a foreign language, even an L1, to get input, to be acquired? Unless we can answer that question, we don't really know. And I'm not a second language acquisition expert. But I've gone back and I've looked through Ortega, some other books that talk about it. And basically, there's two theories that really dominate our field. One comes from Noam Chomsky, way back in the 60s, where he really sort of revolutionized our view of how languages are learned. And the other is from Krashen in the 80s, which either his theory or derivatives of it are still kind of predominant in our field. Now, Chomsky's theory was that there's a part of the brain, back in those days we believed the brain was hardwired. There's a hardwired part of the brain that does all language. It's called the language acquisition device. And it's the same with all human beings. We're born with it. And as a result, he believed that there's a universal grammar. There's a certain grammar that all people in all languages have. Krashen then talked about how language is not acquired through study, per se, but through comprehensible input. He talked about input, listening, and reading as being the way that we acquire language. It has to be comprehensible. It led to great things like the extensive reading approaches and extensive listening approaches we have now. And of course, there's been a lot of controversy for both theories. And in Krashen's case, Swain's output hypotheses and Long's association of meaning and interactivity hypotheses, but still, these are still the two kind of primary theories. The other ones are built on in language acquisition. Well, I don't know about you, but as a classroom teacher, something's always bothered me about those theories. They didn't quite fit what was happening in my classroom. I give students a lot of input, and that didn't seem to be the critical factor. And I look at these words: comprehensible input, input, output, speech acts, recycling device, high-frequency words and corpus, and another sort of interesting area, phonemes, task analysis, and retrieval. And there's something missing. Something missing from this. Not that these theories are wrong, but there's some other things that aren't covered that I found in this classroom, growing up classroom experience, like motivation, or things like that. In fact, so much of our theories of learning is that teachers just throw information into students' head like we're filling vessels. And this is my hand drawing of a painting I saw in a Catholic elementary school in Portland, Oregon. It knocked me out. There's a teacher, and she's speaking on facts, and these facts are flowing into the little children's heads, whose heads are opened up. The school went out of business, by the way, sold into a restaurant complex. Wow, what a fantastic picture. And it's a picture of the way we built so much of our methodology on. That all the teaching comes in the language, how we understand the language. And what the teacher does, learners are just kind of like the dark matter of the universe. We shine all these lights on language. We don't know what's happening with the learners or their brains. Other than those theories I mentioned. Whereas in my experience in the classroom, learning is more like this. Something more like that. So what's missing? Well, actually, it was a man from Korea that came up with a variation of Chomsky's theory in the 1990s. An Soo-won, he reported this based on his research at Jolt in Japan. That's right, in Japan. And he added one more factor. He said, well, acquisition depends on three factors: the language acquisition device, the brain, in other words, input of the language. But he had another factor: the language need is critical to acquisition. And his research with children found that. Children need language acquired much more quickly than those that don't. Yeah, this is getting more to what I experience with my own students. This is getting closer. But what are those things that are missing from the theories? those cold kind of clinical theories of acquisition. I mean, what about emotion? What about relationships? What about the learner experience? What about happiness? Do these affect learning? What about the human factor? For me, there's always been something missing. And now, I'd like you quietly for 1 minute to just think about your own theory of how language is acquired. What factors influence language acquisition? I'll give you just 1 minute to think about it, maybe write notes if you have the handout that was online. And then I'll give you a couple minutes to discuss it with somebody else. So the first minute, please just think about it, brainstorm with yourself a little bit. I'm just using a brain-friendly technique to get your brain activated in this area to be thinking about these things. But actually, this is where brain studies is so interesting. We're finding out all kinds of things we never suspected before are related to learning. Like two of the big ones are exercise and sleep. You can't learn anything without sleep. And people that get 6 hours of sleep, 5 nights in a row, their cognitive performance goes down 60%. 60%. And naps are also important. Even for people that do get lots of sleep, naps are also very important for cognitive processing. Now we know that all memory is internalized while you're sleeping. Your brain is more active when you're asleep than when you're awake. In a stage before REM, your brain will be going through the things that you learned. Those same neurons will be firing the same patterns. Maybe 1,000 times it'll go through that sequence. And it causes those neurons to make permanent connections. And if you're woken up during that period, like I am these days with my 3-week-old baby, you forget everything. So I'm going to tell you something else that's kind of mysterious in the finding of brain science. I'm going to talk about the critical ages. You know the critical age hypothesis that's been controversial for about 20 or 30 years. You know, at age 12, your brain changes and you learn language a different way. You can never sound like a native speaker if you learn language after the critical age. Well, we now know it exists and we know how it works. And not only that, we know that there are hundreds of critical ages for various parts of the brain. There's times when certain parts of the brain are more high functioning, processing, and development, form something. Whether it's related to movement, vision, audio things. And basically, it seems like there's 2 things that affect a critical age or cause a critical age. One is BDNF. BDNF is like neuron fertilizer. It's the food for neurons. It makes them healthy. It causes the brain to make new neurons even. And it's always present, but during a critical age, it decreases. It becomes hard to get. So only those neurons that are fired at their connections will stay, and the others will die. And that's why cats with seeing only vertical lines won't be able to see horizontal lines after a certain age because they're critical age. The other is myelination. That's where fat cells wrap around the neurons and increase the speed that they shoot information up and down. And for example, with teenagers don't really think much about the future outcomes of things. They're bad at it. So do things like drunk driving or jumping off a cliff where there's a lot of rocks. Not thinking about it might kill them. And it's because they have that part of their brain exists, but it hasn't myelinated yet. And myelination causes processing to go up to 100 times faster. And so that part of their brain isn't functioning very well until about the age of 20 or so. Well, I'm going to talk about one critical age, one that Pat Poole studied with infants. And basically, there's one of the infants. Basically, she found that somewhere around 10 months of age, there's a critical age. Before that time, infants can hear every phoneme of every language. when they're born. And they can hear R's and L's, and as for us in Japan, that's a big one, where every single sound. But something happens around 10 months where they stop being able to hear the sounds of other languages and become better at hearing the sounds of their own language or their mother's own language. Of course, they can't process language at 8 months. They don't know what language is. But it's because their brains are sampling the sound systems that they hear all the time. And for example, this shows Japanese vowels. There are 5 vowels, and there's like 5 clusters of sounds, versus English vowels where there's 8. So Japanese babies will be sampling these sounds, and they'll lose the ability to hear the other sounds, like the ones in English, or something like that. For example, she did a study with American and Taiwanese babies, 6 to 8 months, 10 to 12 months. And she found that American babies lose the ability to hear this like sh sound in Chinese. I can't imitate it because I can't hear it myself. But there's like a sh. Chinese people can hear the difference right away, but I can't. I don't know about Koreans. But American babies lose the ability to identify that sound. They're actually better at it when they're younger and lose that ability. Whereas Taiwanese babies get better at it. So she thought, well, what if we had American babies listening to Chinese speakers and getting the same sound samples? Would they get the ability to hear that language? And they did. Actually, her theory says it's critical aging. But let's let Cat cool.
If we bathe American babies in the Mandarin Chinese, we present them with 12 sessions, 25 minutes each, and present them with 4 different talkers over those 12 sessions, and they hear a lot of syllables. They get 33,000 syllables on average, allowing them to take lots of statistics. If this is a critical period of development, then exposure to Mandarin should cause them to learn. So these are what the sessions looked like as we ran them with babies in the laboratory.
Jasper, 早安飞。嗨，我们要来讲一个故事哦。今天要讲的故事是《小熊七七探险记》，来看看发生了什么事情哦。小熊七七在这里。好，哦，有一天啊，小熊七七说
Now, are you learning any Mandarin yet? Okay, look how attentive the babies are. May certainly has their attention in this little task.
一个绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈，转一下，转一圈，嘿，一圈，再一次哦，转1、2、3，2个圈，再一个1、2、3。
Okay.
So, American babies that don't have that kind of training, just 5 hours, lose the ability to hear that sound. Whereas American babies or Taiwanese babies, just like 5 hours of listening like that, would gain that ability. What does this mean? Does this mean that if we take Korean and Japanese babies and give them about 5 hours of English input, that they will learn the English phonetic system, although they'll never have as much trouble with listening comprehension or with pronunciation problems in the future? Probably. And that's what she thought too. So she thought, what if we made audio or video materials that we could play for babies to make them learn our language phonetic system? And she did that. She took the same videos, the ones of May, that teacher. She did the same videos, and they're even better than the live because her face was so big. And they played them for American babies, and an amazing thing happened. They didn't learn anything. No acquisition of that sound at all. That's what's amazing. What happens that babies can learn from live speaking, but they can't learn from video? There's something about babies' brains that's social. There's something about the human factor about this. And this is not in any of the theories, right? And is it just for infants, or does this continue with junior and senior high school, university students, or elementary students? Is there a human factor for them too, that they need a live person for them to be able to acquire language? Obviously, something changes, but how much? these are the things we've never thought about. And these are, you know, the social brain. And maybe it's, we always talk about how, well, someday there'll be robots for teachers instead of human beings. But not if this is right. These are babies at least. And these are some of the strange facts I keep coming across in reading about brain studies and listening to the people who are doing research in that area. And these strange facts don't give us answers. They're just like fingers pointing at questions we haven't even asked yet and answers we don't have. And this is really fascinating because I believe our whole theory of classroom teaching, language acquisition is going to change radically in the next 20 years. As we learn more about this, we do more experiments like Pat Poole did. And most of these strange facts, these pointing fingers, many of them for me are related to theories of plasticity in the human brain. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. How different our theory is now than it was in 1960 or 1980 when we believed the brain was hardwired. That our brain was hardwired because of our genes determined, you know, all the connections. Where now it's completely impossible because there's not so many genes. Now we know the brain forms a completely different way, and our brains are completely plastic. You can take one area of a brain and transplant it to another area. If you connect it the same way, it'll work the same way. So the visual cortex and the audio cortex are pretty much the same. And this is something we didn't know until recently. And even 20 years ago, if a scientist said that, he'd just be rejected or laughed out of business. But there were 3 scientists that gave us new ideas in neuroplasticity. And I like to call them the Mother Teresa, the outcast, and the smart-ass kid. The smart-ass kid. The first one is a smart-ass kid. His name is Bob. When he was 24, this is not when he was 24, this is what he looks like recently. When he was 24 years old, his father, this is the 1960s, his father had a massive stroke. He was completely paralyzed in his arms and his legs. And the medical belief at the time was if the part of your brain that controls your arm or your leg dies, if paralysis is permanent, you'll never regain use. And that's what the doctors told him. Well, this smart guy didn't believe it. He thought, somehow I must be able to train my father to walk again.